It's a great pleasure for us to have you here in the house. We feel particularly responsible in supporting educational issues.
Yeah.
And now, having such a successful biography in front of us, of course we would like to find out how important, Mr. Penrose, was family for you, the whole setup. I mean, you were very privileged in a way that you had a lot of understanding on the side of parents, but normally kids have also fractions with their family. Sort of, how would you judge the importance of the family for your career?
I think it's clear that my family background was very important to me in my development, scientific development in particular. My father was a scientist. He was on the biological side, but he had a very great interest in mathematics and also in the arts. He was a very good artist himself, and interested also in music. His father was an artist, a professional artist, but his family history was not scientific at all. They were a Quaker family, all very artistic, but he broke away very much in being a scientist. His brother was a well-known surrealist artist in Britain, Sir Roger Penrose, who was a friend of Picasso and Max Ernst and Man Ray and various people in the surrealist movement. My father was in his art, he was very much representational. He wasn't, I'm not sure what he thought of the surrealist movement, but he was very much a scientist. And I certainly got a great deal of my scientific attitude from my father. But not only from my father, I think also my older brother Oliver was a big influence. He was very precocious, much more so than I was. He was 2 years ahead at school of his age, and he knew an awful lot, and I would turn to him whenever I wanted to know something, if it was in physics mainly. Mathematics my father knew about, but not so much on the physics side. And I seem to remember my brother reading to me from Mr. Tompkins' books, the Gamow, not very beautiful books on either on relativity or quantum physics. These were at an age when I was before my teens, really. This was actually in Canada. We were in Canada during the war. We went over just before the war, the Second World War, and we came back just after it finished. And my father got a job. Well, he became director of psychiatric research at the Ontario Hospital in London, Ontario, where we were in Canada. And then he got a job as professor of human genetics at University College, London. So that was his area. There was quite a lot of statistics in what he did, and I think he was quite innovative when it came to statistics. I never took a particular interest in statistics, but certainly the beauty of mathematics, as well as science generally, was something that came from him. He had a great enthusiasm for these things. And in particular, just as one example, when I told him that, this was back in England, I should say, when I told him at the age of, must have been 15, I think, and I heard at school that our teacher was going to teach us calculus the next day. And my father, I could see, got worried because he wanted to be the one to teach me calculus. So he immediately took me away into a corner and started to teach me calculus. He did it very well, but I think the thing impressed me most was just that he felt so strongly. This was something he wanted to show me, the beauties, not just the techniques, but the beauty of the subject, how magnificent it was.
So there was almost a competition between your father's idea of introduction compared to the teacher.
Yes, I think he wanted to do it his way.
Yeah, great.
And I think it was also, he was very geometrical, which is something I got very much from him. My mother also was interested in geometry, but she was much more in the background. She didn't particularly take on that role. She was more important if I wanted to talk about any personal matter whatsoever. Any personal matter with my father was a complete hopeless. But my mother was better. Not all that good, but she was better than my father.
But sort of, would you think sort of the arts somehow were important and supportive of the development in science?
It wasn't a deliberate... In his case, I don't think he thought that the arts were an important part of science. I don't know, he just had this feeling for science, that obviously it was an artistic appreciation. Whether he sort of thought in principle that this was a good thing or not, I'm not sure. But he certainly had a way of demonstrating things which was very much in a playful way. So he used to make things, usually out of wood. He had a little saw which he pedalled, and he cut things out of wood. And these were to make toys, often toys for children, grandchildren, friends. But often as not, they were demonstrations. He would have, I remember particularly, he had a slide rule which was to demonstrate some various things to do with conditions in, I think, mental diseases, and not necessarily diseases, but mental qualities. And there was a combination of about 12 different slides, and they would all slide independently and give you some conclusion, diagnostic conclusion out of these different factors, which would all combine in some complicated way.
So what kind of hobbies did you develop in this kind of environment? You had certainly a library at home. You had access to the library.
Yes.
And
there were certainly books around, and a lot of, well, either philosophical books or... In my father's office, he had a particular room. Well, I'm thinking we had two places, a country house and a one in London. And he had a lot of books on different topics. The one in the country I was remembering particularly, where there are philosophical books and so on. So, but many different areas. He certainly had an interest in the arts, also in writing, in the Shakespeare, for instance. He was a very great fan of Shakespeare, but I should make a point here. He was a great believer that the person called Shakespeare was not the author of the plays. And there was a book which he got his inspiration from, which was by a man called Looney, a rather unfortunate name because it suggests the ideas are crazy, but he was very insistent that people would not call him Loney or anything like that. But the book made a very strong case, and I was quite persuaded, I think I am rather persuaded, that the case that Shakespeare, or the person William Shakespeare, who had no education and no books whatsoever, which is a very striking fact, and no indication that, apart from a few signatures, that he ever wrote anything.
Do you think it was Bacon? Or?
No. I think the view that my father followed, and I think it's the most probable one, was that it was Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. But I mean, this is the case for any particular individual was much weaker than the case against Shakespeare. I always thought this. The fact that the person who had no books and was probably illiterate could write those amazing plays seemed to me quite a very strong case. But the case for any particular individual was not so strong. But I thought the case of de Vere was not so bad. Maybe that was the right answer, but I wouldn't. I have no real independent, apart from forming views. I went to see the Tempest with my family not so long ago, and that seemed to be very clearly a play where the author himself was revealing himself, and the person Prospero was clearly somebody who was in the aristocracy. He was not somebody who came up from nothing.
Right.
So I think I do feel there was something in the case there.
But what did you do in your spare time?
I used to make things a lot.
You make things.
I was quite. Yeah, when I was, well, these are more in my Canadian years, when I was between the ages of 8 and 13. I remember making a universal calendar, a moon clock, you looked at the moon and the phase and the direction, you could tell what time it was, you see. And then we made, with my father, we made the polyhedra, the regular polyhedra, and so I remember that came about because I must have been really quite young, and I saw a pattern of hexagons on some floor, I think it was a countertop,
Right.
and I saw all these regular hexagons, and I thought, if you go on far enough, could they bend around in a sphere, you see? Is it possible to cover a sphere with regular hexagons? And so I put this to my father, and he said, no, it's not possible. But if it was pentagons, then you can do it, you see.
So that's what actually...
So he showed me how to do the dodecahedron, and this inspired the interest I had on polyhedra. But I made other things too, which were sometimes quite silly things. But oh, and also I had a bad experience, because when we left, when we had to travel back, it was still at a time where you had to be careful about what boat you were on. You see, it was a bit secretive. Right. And exactly what date one would travel was only revealed rather late. Yeah. And so it was revealed exactly when we had to leave, quite quickly. And there were many things in a cupboard which my parents did not have the time to sort. And among these, in particular, was a little book I had written, a sort of science fiction book with characters from different planets. But it was a pop-up book, so you opened it, and then all the characters would come up and you see them. And this, unfortunately,
you lost.
It's lost.
Oh,
I don't know if anybody has found it now somewhere, but it's gone.
Did your father encourage you to read?
Curiously enough, I didn't read very much. I was not. I think my older brother, Oliver, did read a lot. He was very well read. But I didn't. It's curious. I was not much of a reader. I think I was always a slow reader. I was slow in many things, I think, but reading also. Perhaps part of the fact was my lack of practice. But I was slow in arithmetic. And indeed, I got moved down a class once when I was first in Canada, because I was too slow at doing mental arithmetic, and I would always get lost.
What do you think is the most important characteristic that supports sort of success in science?
It's very hard to generalize, but I think in my case, the important thing was a certain kind of laziness, which curiously enough goes against looking things in books, because I found that so difficult to... I don't know whether the internet now would make a difference, but it was always easier for me to rediscover things than to look them up, you see. So if I wanted to know something, and it was something that was in principle possible to do,
right.
You could, I mean, in mathematics you can often do this. To see what was the truth, you try and find it yourself, rather than looking up in an authoritative work.
Right.
And I think doing this an awful lot was important to me. So I developed doing things for myself rather than appealing to authority. And this has been a big factor in my own personal development. I wouldn't like to say anything which has been important to me is necessarily the same for other people. And I think in Oliver's case, my older brother, he was much better read, and he understood. He was certainly well read, and he had very quick at reading books. And I had the advantage of I could ask him, you see, if there was something I didn't know, maybe which...
And you were obviously very close to each other.
Yes. I think we were. Probably, well, yeah. It's hard to judge these things. Yeah. But he was always there, and he was always helpful, you see, if I wanted to know something. And he was also somebody who was prepared, if he found something interesting in science, he would often tell me.
Now, as a father of a 13 years old, do you think parents can actually do things they sort of, you had your father somewhat a unique experience. Do you use parts of that, or how do you deal with a 10 or teenie today?
In my father's case, he used to go, I remember, this was quite important, he used to go for long walks when we were in the country, long walks, and he would talk to us about largely biological things, because you could see plants and so on. So that was a very nice experience, and somehow the pleasure of learning things was accompanied by these experiences on going for walks. I feel in some way my father was a better influence on me than I am on my son in some ways. He's very interested in these things, and certainly when he wants to know something, I'm very happy to talk to him about these things. But
it's a casual, rather than a kind of constructive tutorship.
Yes, but it was never like that with my father.
No,
it wasn't a tutorship or anything. It was just casual. It was always casual. Yes, it was just when things came up. I might ask a question, or he might just say things which would be of interest to him.
So in a way, you would also consider it a good approach if kids have the possibility to raise questions to same age groups.
Well, it's a curious thing that I always used to call my father by his first name, you see. And I continued this right through life. My brothers and sister used to call him, I think there was a stage when they used to call him professor, you see, which is, I didn't like that. So I just called him Lionel, which is his name. Yeah. And this was just for some, I don't know why. I also told my mother, Margaret, you see, it was, they were just like friends as much as anything.
Right.
And also my son calls me Roger too. But I think he does this curiously deliberately, because he knows I used to call my father by his first name, and so he is deliberately calling me in the way I would respond to him. So he sometimes calls his mother Vanessa, and sometimes he calls her Mum or Mother. Mum, I think, is quite usual, but he always calls me Roger. So there is this kind of relationship of being able to relate on equal terms in a way, which I think is...
Does he have an iPad?
He has all these things, yes.
He has all these things. Does
He's very much up with that.
Do you fear the influence of the modern world of distraction to be so close?
Question. I mean, clearly these are techniques which he needs to know, and so I can get away with not knowing them, mainly because I have other members of the family who can help me when needed. So if I run into a technical problem with as I frequently do, then my first line of defense is my wife, who is much better than I am, and my second line of defense is my son, who is very skilled at many of these technical things. I think one of the things that worries me is that although this is an extremely valuable skill, which is at the moment very necessary in what people do in the current world, what the world will be like in 10 years' time, will those skills be still the useful skills because things move so fast? Maybe the technology will have changed so much, let's say 20, 30 years from now.
There's a great temptation to adopt it and to consider it a sort of a very sustainable device. Yes,
it's very difficult to know, because predicting the future of technology is completely impossible, I think, because often developments depend on technical details, which certainly one wouldn't know, because probably nobody knows these details, and they come later. I mean, the technology that we depend on now with computers, so much of it depends on these transistors and developments that have come about, which, I mean, okay, we talk about Turing and the kinds of ideas, the universal computing, which was a very important idea, but it would have, if we still had to have these huge, monstrous devices,
Right.
it wouldn't have developed in the way that it has.
So, do you have some recommendations for your son, sort of, to give it the importance it has, but to support other talents too?
I think the important thing, a very important thing, is understanding. And this is important in teaching. You see, my wife teaches mathematics at a boys' school, Abington School in Oxford. And an important feature is, because so much of education, school education in England, I'm sure in many places, is governed by examinations. So it's extremely competitive, and the way they judge is on examination results. And so what is the best way in a school, they think, to get good results in examinations? Well, there's a certain conflict, because if you want to teach people mathematics properly, you teach them the understanding. You don't teach them the rules.
Right.
You teach them the rules, maybe you get through the exam quickly, but you don't really understand the mathematics. You want to know what you're doing and why you're doing it. Why do those rules work? And that is often a better way of getting through the exams too, but it's not always clear. And you get some teachers who are very good at drilling people and without much understanding. They just tell them the rules and they drill them and get them to do the rules. But that's not real teaching. That's getting through exams.
We have in Germany, in present day, we have a little debate about what we need to achieve in the classroom.
Yeah.
And the new pedagogical order says we teach them competence rather than content.
Yeah.
Which I fear is that if in the end they just know where Google is,
Yes.
and rely on Google rather than understanding exactly what you were saying, sort of content. I mean, how can you actually do medical studies if you don't actually know and you just know where to look for the manual?
But it's a difficult question. I think it's I completely agree that the understanding is crucial. And you can get so far with looking. I mean, it's so much easier to look information up, but there are several dangers involved with that. I mean, it's easy, so that means you have access to much more information. But the filtering of that information is very much fashion-driven. So how do you know what's true? How do you know what's more likely to be a fruitful thing to follow? Well, it's based on fashionable ideas. And so it's very hard in science to break away from these things. If you want to do something which is out of the ordinary, it's very difficult. And there are real issues here because, I mean, for example, the correspondence that I get, particularly the correspondence which is actually written in letters, but also on email and so on. A good proportion of this is from people who want to get their ideas, an audience from me, because they think of me as somebody who doesn't necessarily follow the mainstream. And therefore I will understand the ideas of these people. Now, almost always, these ideas are crazy. You see, when I say crazy, I mean they don't make sense.
Yeah.
They're completely in contradiction.
They're obsessed
with known
with
facts.
It.
Yes, and I can't spend very little time, or maybe occasionally I will respond, but most of these I haven't got the time to look at. But how do you, if you want to allow people this freedom not to follow the mainstream, but on the other hand, you need to make sure that the ideas which are completely nonsensical don't get a hold as well. And often they do if they get a following.
Right.
So if they get enough following, then they will become almost respectable. And it's very difficult you can't make these judgments by machine. That certainly doesn't work. But how do you make the judgments?
So very often these fashions, as you call this, kind of very attractive, spontaneous results or imagination, very often sabotage creativity.
It's very difficult. I mean, the trouble is that it's very subjective. I mean, you get people who get very attracted by a certain idea, and that doesn't make it good, because it may be they think it's attractive, and it may well not be that it carries any possible fruitful content.
What could you consider a fashion at the moment? Is that string theory?
Well, yes. I'm at the moment trying to complete a book which I started writing 10 years ago, which has the title Fashion, Faith and Fantasy in the New Physics of the Universe. And the fashion was, at least 10 years ago, particularly aimed at string theory. Now, I should point out, you see, that I'm not really against string theory, if by string theory we mean the original ideas which were put forward, which attracted me also. I thought the original ideas of string theory were beautiful and interesting and worth following. However, what I do not feel is interesting and worth following are the way it went, because people discovered, following certain procedures, that the theory works according to the rules they had, only in space-time dimensions which were initially 26. Well, you see, we have 4 space-time dimensions, 3 space and 1 time. Yeah. We don't have 25 space and 1 time dimension. Now, they had ways of saying, oh, well, so many are rolled up in little balls you don't see. Well, I never found that explanation convincing for various reasons I consider to be good reasons. So I immediately thought, no, 26 dimensions, that's going the wrong way. Okay, it came down to 10 dimensions together with supersymmetry. Well, that was no better, really. I mean, if it came down to 4 dimensions, okay, that's serious. And there are versions of strings which still have applications in 4 dimensions, so I will take those much more seriously. But it's not the strings which I worry about, it's the extra dimensions. And I think there are very good reasons for believing that those, if they are really space dimensions in any serious sense, that these cannot be right. So this was really what I was attacking. But the fashion took off very much, and also the aesthetics kind of changes in a way, because the initial view of what is attractive shifted into other things which are mathematically attractive, but there's a difference here. You see, you have to see whether it's still physically attractive. I mean, there are ideas which have had a big influence on mathematics, which have come from string theory, and there's no question about that. That certainly is true. And some of these ideas are very beautiful, but it's a different kind of thing. And it doesn't carry, in my mind anyway, the kind of aesthetic quality of rightness. I don't know how to say that, but largely it just doesn't fit in with the world we see. And it would have to fit in with that world we see, together with mathematical features which have elegance and coherence and correctness in a certain sense, which I feel are essential to.
So in 100 years' time, sort of, if you had the chance to look on this planet, look into your office and to your colleagues, what would be the most intriguing thought you get an answer for? What would you ask first, your then colleague, just about 100 years younger or 150 years younger?
I mean, ask them what they thought was important about this period of the present period in time. Yeah. Gosh, I don't know. That's a difficult question, because.
And what sort of about the actual, what be of greatest interest to you as far as solutions are concerned?
Well, let me talk very personally. You see, I can talk about things which I myself find, to me, look like interesting developments. And I'm not going to make any statement about what will be viewed in 100 years' time,
right,
because maybe people will have gone off in other directions which will eclipse these ideas completely. But as far as things I've done myself are concerned, I really think that the most important development is twistor theory. Now, this is something which was almost exactly 50 years ago. So 50 years ago, I had a particular idea. I can date it because it came very shortly after the Kennedy assassination,
right,
which was in fact 50 years ago. And this was an idea which developed into what I call twistor theory.
67, 1967?
The
sort of first proposed.
The first paper came out.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm talking about when the idea came, which is not dated
okay.
with a paper.
Okay.
But this was in must have been in 55. What are we talking about? 1965. No, 19. Yeah, where are we?
Yeah. What is it? But sort of, where would
it's
be?
not right, is it?
What do you think? You know, I asked the other day a physicist who is sort of trying to cool the atoms as much as possible, sort of, and then he says, my first question would be, how cool can you get the atom in 100 years? So what would be your...
I think cooling of atoms it's not my area, you see.
Yeah.
But it also gets into questions of what you mean by that. Because you have, 0-point energies and so on, and you want to say what do you mean by zero temperature? And I suspect there are issues there which are...
So the most important question you have towards your field of expertise...
I mean, let me I'll change the subject a bit. You see, what I think is the most important development, which has not yet happened, and I hope will happen within the next several years, maybe not, depends on some insights of the same magnitude as we got from Einstein. And I'm talking about quantum mechanics. The quantum mechanics, in my view, is an inconsistent theory. Now, you see, it works incredibly well for systems which are small in a certain sense. And I have to be careful about the sense, because quantum effects can stretch for 150 kilometers and probably a lot more. So when I say small, I mean small in the sense of how much mass is displaced. And when this amount of mass displacement is small, quantum mechanics works perfectly. But the inconsistencies arise when you start to have larger displacements of mass. And the inconsistencies come within quantum mechanics itself, because quantum mechanics consists of two parts. One is what we call unitary evolution. That's the Schrödinger equation. That is a deterministic equation which tells you how the state evolves. And the second is sometimes called the collapse of the wave function, or what happens when an observation is made. And that is a non-deterministic procedure. It's a probabilistic procedure. And it is simply inconsistent to get a probabilistic behavior out of a deterministic equation.
Right.
And put blatantly, it is an inconsistency. Now, many people, of course, don't call it an inconsistency. They say it's a matter of interpretation of what the wave function means, and so on and so on. But at root, it is to me an inconsistency. And this inconsistency needs to be resolved by a better theory. So I am, roughly speaking, in alignment with Einstein, with Schrödinger, and also, curiously, with Dirac, who formulated the basic rules of quantum mechanics more precisely than anyone. And he is on record as having said that he believes that this is not the final answer, and that, in fact, in the Bohr-Einstein debates, that Einstein was probably right. And that even though he was considered to have lost the debates, that his position that something needs to be done about quantum mechanics, even if it wasn't quite what he thought, something has to be done. And the subject needs to be completed. And that completion, in my view, will come about when the subject is combined with Einstein's greatest contribution, namely his general theory of relativity. So the general principles which underlie his theory of gravitation have their effect on quantum mechanics, and these have to mean that quantum mechanics, the rules will have to bend in some subtle way which we do not yet understand. Right. So I think that the resolution of that problem is something which I hope will come within the next few decades, and in 100 years' time people would look back and say, yes, it was beautiful to see the solution to that problem.
Great. Just to go once back to you as in your role as a father, do you have any kind of rules in treating your son, or do you leave that entirely to your wife?
She is a
Does he have to go to bed early, or?
The rules are really pretty flexible. My wife is much stronger on rules than I am, even though she in principle is not a rule person. But being a school teacher, I suppose, means that this also. So she likes to restrict his attention on the computer and so on, and reading in bed and so on. But the rules, if you visit my family, you will see they are not very strictly adhered to.
So he's allowed to be lazy.
He is allowed to be lazy, but not that. You know, she worries more than I do about it. I think she's right that she needs to. You know, does he have to practice his various instruments that he plays, or?
Oh, he does.
The main thing is that when he does it when he enjoys it, and that's important.
So you think that's the most important, really, sort of to grow up in a kind of satisfactory and satisfying.
He's getting better at that. I think it's clear that he had a period of finding a lot of things very difficult, like work for school and so on. But I think now he finds somehow that these things are more enjoyable, and he gets down to it quite well. So I think he's not bad when it gets down to things. It is a question of enjoyment, I think. Things which are not enjoyed can be extremely difficult to do. But somehow if we can stimulate the enjoyment aspect of it, then that is very helpful.
Yeah, in a way your whole life is in a way the best proof of this kind of attitude.
Yeah.
Towards education.
Well, I think it was true of my father. There was no rule, there was no line you could draw between his work and his fun, what he did for making toys or playing games or whatever it was. And you couldn't see where the line was, you see. And many of the things, there was no clear line. I mean, I remember there was some particular condition of in the mental hospital where he worked, where it was microcephaly, and he made a statue out of wood of this character in the hospital as a demonstration of the condition, and he made the statue, you see. Okay. And I think he did it just because he enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much, Sir Roger Penrose.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.